"16 years ago, I was banned from South Africa. Those were perhaps the darkest days of apartheid, during which I had known many of the few, those brave and tenacious white people who actively opposed the brutalities of the state. But I never met the woman whose courage often inspired and nurtured them, whose name was and is synonymous with decency in South Africa, Helen Suzman. For 13 years, Helen Suzman was the sole representative of the Progressive Party in the South African Parliament. As state murder and torture, house arrests, bannings, and myriad forms of repression sealed off South Africa from much of the world, Helen Suzman stood up, alone, day after day, to attack the countless racist laws which the governments of Verwoerd and Foster pushed through, while the official opposition remained on its hands, mute with indecision and fear. In the 104 days of her first session in Parliament, she made a total of 66 speeches, moved 26 amendments, and put down 137 questions. It was an incredible performance, and the hatred directed at her was almost tangible. She was a woman in a patriarchal society, a liberal and a Jew in a racist and often anti-Semitic state. Abuse and smear were routine. Helen Suzman also has had to live with the many and harsh ironies of a white liberal brought up in isolation from the black majority and supported by a rich and privileged electorate who, she herself admits, would not vote for her if they thought her ideas would win the day. Helen Suzman has come to London for this interview. Did you yourself ever feel during those 13 years that you were deceiving yourself? I mean, there you were sitting in a cosy assembly, debating racism, talking of democracy, as if South Africa was in Europe, not in Africa. That sense of delusion, almost.
Well, one tried to draw the distinction between a real democracy and a country in which 72% of the people are denied the vote, 80% in fact, as you include coloured and Indian people. So one made no attempt to tell the government in any way that the system was satisfactory from a democratic point of view. Quite the opposite. One was using Parliament to try and reveal all the time the terrible shortcomings of the system. And I would say that, you don't have much alternative, John, when you live there, if you're a liberally minded South African, to use it in its best sense. If you stay there, you can leave, of course, and a lot of people have left. But if you want to stay there and try and fight the system, well, then you've got to use whatever methods are available to you. And if you're not part of a revolutionary movement, Parliament is the major forum, and the opposition party in Parliament is the major political weapon that you have to use.
But can you give us an idea what apartheid is like on a day-by-day basis, on a mundane, a banal level? I mean, can you encapsulate it in one event, one moment?
Well, I'd have to translate myself from a white South African into a black South African. It would mean that I'd have to get up probably at 4:30 in the morning to travel from Soweto, the big black township, which is about 15 miles out of Johannesburg, and get myself to work on a very overcrowded train, which is very different from the transport used by whites. And I would then come to my job in the city, and probably I'd be either an unskilled or semi-skilled worker, earning a fairly low wage. And I could be stopped by a policeman at any time and asked to produce a document showing that I had the right to be in the city. That intrinsically is what apartheid means to an urban black. He is under surveillance. He's got to be able to show that he's entitled to be in the urban area.
What happens to those people when they're dumped in those so-called homelands? What lives do they then lead?
Of course, the Minister of Cooperation and Development would immediately object to the use of the word dumped. He would say that that no longer takes place. But
perhaps some would object to his title,
yes,
the Minister of Cooperation and Development.
Yes.
What in truth does that mean?
The control of people, really, that's what it is, of the movement of black people. And it's essentially a discriminatory law because it doesn't apply to whites, it doesn't apply to coloured people, people of mixed birth, and it doesn't apply to South African Asians, except that they're not allowed to go into one province at all, I might say. The South African Asians are forbidden to enter the Orange Free State, one of the 4 provinces. But they can move from one area to the other without going through all these terrifically difficult procedures that blacks have to go through. Now, what it means is that now, these days, the minister will tell you, and this is correct, that they do not move people until they have supplied certain essentials. Now, generally that is water, piped water, and there are lots of latrines supplied, and a school, and sometimes a clinic.
And what
that's it. That's it. I mean, when the people get there, they have to rebuild their houses. They're sometimes given tents in which they may live for a certain number of months while they're trying to build their houses. And you must remember that in the main, these are women and children and old men who are being moved. The younger men are generally working as migrant workers in the cities. Now, I wouldn't know how to start to build my own house, I must tell you. Even if you gave me all the materials and the specifications, I would find it very difficult. And I'm sure they do too. And they provide rations. And I remember last year when I raised this matter, the minister said they provided rations for 3 days. And I said to him, and what happens on the 4th day? Because these people are now in an area which is strange to them. They have not established themselves in any way. They possibly have lost the jobs that they had in the old nearby cities or towns. And they're there. I mean, many of them live on the pensions, the old age pensions of one of the members of the family.
Another person of courage is, of course, Nelson Mandela and his wife, Winnie Mandela. Now, you're one of the few people who are able to visit Nelson Mandela in prison. What is he like these days?
Well, the last time I visited him was about a year ago, and he was in very good health and very good spirits. He's quite a remarkable person. I mean, there is nothing cringing about this man, although he's been in jail for 20 years. He is a very forthright person and clearly very much in control of the situation. He's had my support as a prisoner. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with his or Winnie's political views, but that's by the way. It's unimportant to me. The important thing is that he is there. He's got a sentence, a life sentence. One of my jobs, I believe, which is an important job, is to keep an eye on prisoners, particularly those people who've been sentenced for what the government prefers to call crimes against the state, but who are politically known as political prisoners by other people.
Some people would say that as long as there's a profit to be made in South Africa, the system of apartheid will survive. I was thinking especially of the enormous investment of British companies in South Africa.
I think, John, that's the old capitalism and apartheid go hand-in-hand argument. And I think there was a lot of truth in that perhaps many years ago when South Africa relied almost entirely on the primary industries of mining and agriculture. And people wanted cheap, unskilled labor, which they got in considerable supply from the homelands or native reserves, as they were then called. I don't think that applies today to nearly the same extent. In fact, it's industrialists that want the change. They want to be able to use skilled black labor. And the major opposition to that has come not from the capitalists, but in fact from the white trade unions.
The British government has stopped publishing a blacklist of British companies that pay their African workers starvation wages. And yet since that blacklist has not been published, we know that the number of African workers getting wages that put them below the poverty line has doubled.
Yes, well, I think they ought to continue to publicise the names of firms that are paying wages that are too low. There are, of course, a number of firms now which say they apply, where the Americans are concerned, the Sullivan Principles, which means better conditions of work, training of blacks, use of blacks in managerial positions, and so on, and the use of black trade unions, or rather negotiating with black trade unions.
How does the white liberal in South Africa, such as yourself, deal with the charge of hypocrisy that embodied in liberalism, white liberalism, is the very privilege that shores up the system of apartheid?
Well, I don't know that one tries to answer that question. It's generally an accusation, rather, that is put by radical people of radical thought who believe that liberals in South Africa are a bulwark against revolution, and the sooner everything collapses, the better, because then there'll be a whole new regime in South Africa. Well, I mean, I personally don't go along with that, and I don't reply to the charges of hypocrisy because I don't think I'm a hypocrite. I do what I can do. It's limited. I'm the first one to admit it.
Do not a great many, if not the majority of blacks, since the Soweto uprising in 1976, now believe that any change, any really serious change that gives power to them in South Africa, inevitably must be inaugurated by revolution, if you like, but by bloodshed, by violence?
Well, they may believe that, but it's one thing to believe a thing. It's another thing to see it come to reality. And, I mean, one must realize, living in South Africa, there's a very sophisticated army, there is a paramilitary force, there is the police force, and there are very many informers among the black people themselves. And together with that, together with the oppressive system of detention without trial, all this makes it very difficult to get any really aggressive movement going in South Africa. You must realize that the political organizations like the African National Congress and the Pan-African Congress are banned organizations, that a great number of the leaders are banned themselves or are in exile, and it's very difficult to get anything like that going. There is urban violence, and I believe that's going to increase.
Why should a black South African living in poverty and under bureaucratic control, past laws and so on, in a township, agree with you? Why should he say there's only one choice left, and that is bloodshed because I have nothing to lose?
Well, I do think he does have something to lose. He has his life to lose. And maybe that's the deterrent. Or maybe he realizes he can be locked up for a long time without recourse to the courts of law. It's a question of power, John, and I don't believe that there is power existing in those particular circumstances. I believe it's got to be mobilized through other forces.
So what you're saying is that one side has the guns and the other side doesn't?
Well, virtually, that's really what it amounts to, which, however, I do, as I have said, believe that there is going to be an increase in all forms of urban violence, but that's very different from an organized rebellion, which I don't believe has a chance of success.
Are whites becoming more frightened?
Some are becoming more frightened, others are becoming more reasonable. Just depends. And a lot of young people have left the country, which is perhaps a very distressing part of it all.
Sean McBride, in the first of this series, said that he believed violence was justified in places like South Africa.
Well,
what are your feelings about that?
I don't like violence at any time, but I don't like it whether it comes from people who are fighting the regime, and I also don't like it when it's institutionalized violence that comes from the government.
Well, he was of course referring to the, as he put it, I think, the right of the victim to resort to violence, yes, to overthrow the oppressor.
Well, he may have a right, if you like to look at it as a balance against institutionalized violence, but what it accomplishes is another thing. And I think that I think the Soweto riots proved very conclusively that you cannot fight armored cars with stones.
But is the reality, though, different? Are the majority of blacks going to accept that violence must not be used? Are they going to take that polite liberal viewpoint and say we won't use violence?
It's not a case of accepting it. It's what is possible for them to do. And really and truly, until you've lived in a country like South Africa and you know what the police and military strength is of that country, and as I say, the laws which allow detention without trial, all these are enormously powerful factors that work against any open rebellion among black people in South Africa. I think it would be tremendous, terrible bloodshed, and the whole thing is not going to happen that way. I think blacks are going to have to mobilize their economic muscle and use it as effectively as possible.
But do, in your view, black South Africans want a country based on racial equality, a country where there is a place for the Helen Suzmans?
Well, I can't speak for the majority of blacks. I don't know that I can speak for any blacks, but I would imagine that there is still a large section of the black population that realizes that South Africa needs whites just as South Africa needs blacks in order to maintain standards and improve them. And certainly the black people that I talk to don't talk about pushing the whites into the sea. They talk about cooperation with whites.
But these are the black people, of course, who are allowed to talk. You have the Black Consciousness Movement, the African National Congress, and other groups that are not visible and indeed are banned.
Yes.
So we're not hearing from them.
No, that's correct. There are radicals who probably think quite differently, and they want nothing except a black majority government, and that's it.
How do the blacks regard you?
It varies. The older ones, I think, still have very considerable understanding of what I've tried to do. And I get well received when I go to Soweto and visit those people. Many of the young radicals probably don't think highly of me at all, probably think of me, as I say, as a bulwark.
Do you ever feel that you might be an anachronism?
Oh, frequently. Most of the time, in fact. Yes, I do. I realize that. But as I say...
Politically speaking.
Yes, well, in every way, possibly. But I mean, the thing is that you have to accept that there is a limit to what you can do. And once you've decided that, you just go hell for leather to do what you can within the existing system. It's all you can do.
What is the future? What do you think South Africa will be like in 10 years' time, as opposed to what you hope it'll be like in 10 years' time?
Well, I think it's going to change much more gradually than I would like to see it change. But I still believe that it will roll on with better living conditions for blacks in the urban areas anyway. Perhaps a greater realization that you can't just shove people around without the world reacting to it, and therefore I hope that there'll be something freezing removals. I think blacks will learn how to use what power they do have, both economic power and the power which they're going to be given in local government. And I believe the country will just go on developing in that way, with changes coming in the socio-economic field rather more rapidly than anything that will come in the political field for black people.
There are a great many people who believe that South Africa has set itself on a course where bloodshed is inevitable. Do you ever feel that you might be a casualty of that same bloodshed?
Well, I think anybody could be a casualty if indeed that happens. And it's not, I mean, it's by no means, beyond the bounds of possibility.
In other words, that opponents won't discriminate between the good whites and the bad whites?
No, obviously not. I mean, if it ever comes to that, there'll be no selectivity at all. It would just be the usual, terrible, mindless rioting, and anybody could be caught up in that situation.
Above all, what makes you angry?
Oh, just the bullying, really. The bullying that goes on in that country, in my country, I should say. I hate to see defenseless people being knocked around. I really hate it. And this is what happens, and it's very upsetting indeed. You feel you want to do something about it.
Helen Suzman, thank you very much.